In 1889, a homesteader in western Kansas survived an entire winter with no supply wagon, no general store within 40 miles, and no government assistance of any kind. He fed his family of 5 using skills he learned from his father, who learned them from the frontier itself. Number 11 on this list was once taught in every rural schoolhouse in America. The USDA quietly removed it from agricultural pamphlets in 1943. Number 6 uses a technique that modern survivalists charge $300 for weekend seminars to teach, but every pioneer grandmother knew it by the age of 12. These 20 tricks kept millions of Americans alive, independent, and completely self-sufficient. Then we were told to stop using them. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 pioneer tricks the government hopes Americans never rediscover. Number 20. Lye soap from wood ash and animal fat. Every pioneer homestead had a leaching barrel sitting beside the fireplace. Hardwood ash, preferably from oak or hickory, was packed into a barrel with holes drilled in the bottom. Rainwater was poured over the top slowly, and what dripped out the bottom was lye water, potassium hydroxide, strong enough to dissolve grease on contact. That lye water was then boiled with rendered animal fat, usually tallow saved from butchering, in a cast iron kettle over an open fire. The mixture was stirred for hours until it thickened and saponified into a brown, slightly rough soap that cleaned everything: clothes, dishes, floors, skin, wounds. A single batch made enough soap to last a family 6 months. The whole process cost nothing because every ingredient was a byproduct of things the family was already doing: burning wood for heat, butchering animals for meat. The ash and the fat were waste. Pioneers turned waste into hygiene. By 1920, Procter & Gamble was spending more on advertising than any company in America, convincing housewives that homemade soap was primitive and that their factory bars were superior. The pioneer knew something the soap company did not want you to figure out. You never needed to buy soap. You only needed a fire and a little patience. Number 19. Root cellaring without electricity. Before refrigeration existed, every farmstead in America had a root cellar, a hole dug into the earth, usually into a hillside, lined with stones or logs, and covered with a thick door. The ground temperature 4 feet below the surface stays between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in most of the continental United States. That is cold enough to preserve potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, cabbages, and apples for 4 to 6 months without any electricity, any chemicals, or any packaging. Pioneers packed root vegetables in layers of damp sand or straw inside wooden crates. The moisture kept them from shriveling. The cool temperature stopped bacterial growth. The darkness prevented sprouting. A properly built root cellar kept a family fed from October through March on nothing but what they grew and stored themselves. When rural electrification arrived in the 1930s and the 1940s, the government pushed refrigerators hard. Rural Electrification Administration loans made them affordable. Root cellars were filled in, converted to storm shelters, or simply abandoned. The skill of knowing which vegetables store and how to layer them disappeared within a single generation. Today, Americans throw away 30 to 40% of their food. Pioneers threw away almost nothing because they understood storage in a way we have completely forgotten. Number 18. Vinegar from apple scraps. Every autumn, after the apple harvest, pioneer women collected the cores, peels, and bruised pieces that could not be eaten fresh or dried. These scraps went into a stoneware crock covered with water and a cloth and set in a warm corner of the kitchen. Within 2 to 3 weeks, wild yeast turned the sugar into alcohol. Within 6 weeks, Acetobacter bacteria converted that alcohol into vinegar. The whole process happened on its own. No special equipment, no purchased cultures, nothing. That homemade apple cider vinegar was used for preserving vegetables, cleaning surfaces, treating sore throats, making salad dressings, tenderizing tough meat, and dozens of other applications. A single crock produced enough vinegar to last a household through winter. The raw material was garbage, literal food waste that would have gone to the compost pile or the hog pen. Today, a bottle of organic apple cider vinegar costs $6 to $8 at the grocery store. Pioneers made it for free from scraps they would have thrown away. The process takes almost no effort. It just takes time and the knowledge that fruit scraps plus water plus patience equals vinegar. That knowledge was once as common as knowing how to boil water. Number 17. Tallow candles from beef fat. When night fell on the frontier, there was no switch to flip. Light came from fire, and the most reliable, longest-burning fire a pioneer could make indoors came from tallow candles. The hard fat around a cow's kidneys and loins, called suet, was rendered down by chopping it fine and melting it slowly in a pot over low heat. The liquid fat was strained through cloth to remove bits of meat and tissue, then poured into molds with cotton wick suspended in the center. Once cooled, those candles burned steadily for hours with minimal smoke. A single steer provided enough suet to make 50 to 70 candles. That was months of light from one animal that was already being butchered for food. The fat was a byproduct. The light was free. By the time kerosene lamps became common in the 1870s and electric light arrived in cities by the 1890s, the entire skill of chandlery, making candles at home, was abandoned. Today, a pack of emergency candles costs $8 at a hardware store. Pioneers made better ones from parts of the cow they were already eating. Number 16. Sourdough starter as permanent leavening. Pioneer families heading west on the Oregon Trail did not pack commercial yeast. It would not survive the journey. Instead, they carried sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria, maintained in a small crock or jar. That starter, fed regularly with flour and water, could last for years. Some starters were passed down through multiple generations across decades. Every morning, the pioneer cook would pull a portion of starter, mix it with flour, water, salt, and a bit of lard, and bake bread in a Dutch oven over coals. The remaining starter went back in the crock, fed with fresh flour and water, ready for tomorrow. No store, no supply chain, no purchasing anything, just flour and water keeping a living organism alive indefinitely. Sourdough was so critical to frontier survival that Alaskan prospectors during the Klondike Gold Rush slept with their starters against their bodies to prevent freezing. They were called sourdoughs as a term of respect. Baking powder and commercial yeast replaced sourdough starters in American kitchens by the early 1900s. Companies like Fleischmann's made fortunes selling something pioneers had been growing for free on their countertops. The starter asked for nothing but attention. The commercial yeast asked for money every single time. Number 15. Smoking meat without a smokehouse. Improvised pit smokehouse for curing meat. Not every homestead had a purpose-built smokehouse, but every homestead smoked meat. When a hog was butchered in November, the cuts that could not be eaten immediately or preserved in salt needed smoking to last through winter. Pioneers without a dedicated structure would dig a shallow pit, build a slow fire of green hickory or applewood at the bottom, hang the meat on a framework of green branches above, and drape wet burlap sacks over the whole arrangement to trap the smoke. This improvised smokehouse worked for days at a time, slowly curing hams, bacon, and sausages with nothing but wood and patience. The smoke deposited antimicrobial compounds onto the surface of the meat. The slow heat dried the outer layer, creating a barrier against bacteria. A properly smoked ham could hang in a cool pantry for 6 months or longer without refrigeration. The USDA now regulates meat curing so heavily that the home smoking techniques pioneers depended on are effectively discouraged for commercial sale. You can still do it for yourself, but the institutional knowledge has been pushed out of mainstream education entirely. First pattern break. Here is what nobody talks about. The pioneers who settled the American frontier were not just farmers. They were chemists, engineers, and biologists who did not know those words. Every trick on this list involves understanding a natural process and exploiting it without electricity, without factories, and without spending money. Lye soap is saponification. Root cellaring is applied thermodynamics. Vinegar making is controlled fermentation. Smoking meat is applied microbiology. These people understood the science without the terminology, and they passed that understanding down through families the way we pass down passwords and Netflix accounts today. When industrialization replaced self-sufficiency, we did not just lose recipes, we lost an entire operating system for living. The companies that replaced these skills did not offer something better. They offered something easier that you had to keep paying for forever. Number 14. Charcoal water filtration. Clean water was not guaranteed on the frontier. Streams could carry disease. Ponds could harbor parasites. Pioneers learned, partly from indigenous knowledge and partly from trial and error, that water filtered through layers of charcoal, sand, and gravel came out cleaner and safer to drink. They would burn hardwood down to charcoal, crush it, and layer it inside a hollowed log or a barrel with a spigot at the bottom. Gravel went at the base, sand in the middle, crushed charcoal on top. Water poured in at the top, passed through each layer, and what came out the bottom was visibly clearer and significantly safer. Activated carbon in the charcoal absorbed organic contaminants, bacteria, and particulates. This is the exact same principle behind every Brita filter and every municipal water treatment plant in America. The difference is that pioneers built theirs from a log and a campfire. Modern filtration systems cost hundreds of dollars and require replacement cartridges that generate ongoing revenue for manufacturers. The pioneer version cost nothing and could be rebuilt anywhere there were trees and rocks. Number 13. Hardtack permanent bread. When flour was plentiful but time and conditions were not, pioneers baked hardtack. Flour, water, and a pinch of salt were mixed into a stiff dough, rolled thin, cut into squares, and baked at low heat until every trace of moisture was gone. The result was a cracker so dense and dry that it could last for years without spoiling. Civil War soldiers carried hardtack that was reportedly baked months or even years before they received it. Pioneer families stored it in tin boxes for emergency rations during blizzards, droughts, or failed harvests. When needed, they soaked it in coffee, crumbled it into stew, or fried it in bacon grease. It was not pleasant food, it was insurance. The knowledge that you could take the most basic staple, flour, and convert it into something nearly imperishable with nothing but an oven was a form of security that no modern pantry can match. Today, we buy emergency food kits for hundreds of dollars that contain freeze-dried meals with shelf lives of 25 years. Pioneers achieved functionally the same thing with flour, water, and heat. Number 12. Ash as fertilizer and pest control. Wood, ash was never thrown away on a pioneer homestead. It was spread across garden beds every spring, where it raised the pH of acidic soil, added potassium and calcium, and helped crops like beans, peas, and brassicas thrive. But ash did more than feed plants. Dusted around the base of squash and melon plants, it repelled slugs and soft-bodied insects that could not cross the alkaline barrier. Mixed into stored grain, it deterred weevils and grain moths. Scattered around the foundation of the cabin, it discouraged ants and other crawling pests from entering. One material, a dozen applications, all free, all from the fire that was already burning for heat and cooking. The modern equivalents, garden lime, potash fertilizer, diatomaceous earth, and chemical pesticides, collectively cost a homeowner $50 to $100 every growing season. Pioneers spent nothing because they understood that the fire gave more than warmth. Number 11. Seed saving across generations. Every pioneer family saved seeds. This was not a hobby. It was the foundation of food security. At the end of every growing season, the best performing plants, the tomato that ripened earliest, the bean that produced the most pods, the corn that grew tallest despite drought, were allowed to go to seed. Those seeds were carefully dried, labeled, and stored in paper envelopes or glass jars for next year's planting. Over decades, this practice created locally adapted varieties perfectly suited to the specific soil, climate, and conditions of each homestead. A family seed collection was a living inheritance, sometimes more valuable than the land itself. The USDA once distributed free seeds to American farmers through congressional seed programs that ran from the 1860s through 1924. Then, commercial seed companies lobbied Congress to end the program. By the mid-20th century, hybrid seeds that could not reliably reproduce replaced open-pollinated varieties, forcing farmers to buy new seeds every single year. Today, 3 companies control over 50% of the global seed market. Pioneers controlled 100% of their own. The trick was never complicated. Let the best plants go to seed. Save those seeds. Plant them next year. Repeat forever. That cycle of independence was broken deliberately, and most Americans have no idea it ever existed. Second pattern break. Here is the part that changes how you see everything. Every skill on this list was replaced by a product. Homemade soap became store-bought bars. Root cellars became refrigerators. Saved seeds became purchased packets. Smoked meat became deli counter cold cuts. None of these replacements were necessarily worse in quality. Some were genuinely better, but every single one of them turned a free, independent skill into a recurring expense. That is not an accident. That is a business model. The entire consumer economy is built on the principle that it is better to buy than to know. Pioneer families operated on the opposite principle. Knowing was better than buying because buying required money you might not have next month. The government did not suppress these skills out of malice. It promoted industrialization, convenience, and commerce because those things generated tax revenue, created jobs, and grew the economy. But the side effect was a population that cannot feed, clean, or sustain itself without a functioning supply chain. The pioneers could. That capability is what was lost and what this list is really about. Number 10. Herbal remedies from wild plants. Before there was a pharmacy on every corner, pioneer families treated common ailments with plants that grew wild on their own land or along the trails they traveled. Willow bark tea for pain and fever contained salicin, the natural precursor to aspirin. Mullein leaf tea loosened chest congestion. Yarrow leaves packed into wounds, slowed bleeding and prevented infection. Elderberry syrup boosted immunity during winter cold season. Plantain leaves, the common lawnweed, were chewed into a poultice and applied to insect stings and minor burns. None of this was mystical. All of it was practical knowledge accumulated over generations and shared between families, neighbors, and the indigenous communities who had used these plants for centuries before European settlers arrived. The Flexner Report of 1910, funded in part by the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, standardized American medical education and systematically discredited herbal and folk medicine traditions. What replaced them was effective but expensive. What was lost was free, and for common complaints, often just as useful. Pioneer cabins were not painted with store-bought paint. They were whitewashed. A mixture of slaked lime and water, sometimes with a handful of salt or a scoop of clay added for durability, was brushed onto interior and exterior walls. The lime created a mildly antiseptic surface that resisted mold, repelled insects, and brightened dark interiors. A single application lasted 1 to 2 years. Reapplication took an afternoon. The materials cost virtually nothing. Limestone was abundant across the American Midwest and South. Burning it in a kiln, slaking it with water, and mixing the paste was a skill every pioneer learned young. Tom Sawyer's famous fence painting scene was about whitewashing, not painting. That is how common it was. Today, exterior house paint costs $30 to $50 per gallon, and a full exterior paint job runs thousands of dollars. Pioneers maintained their homes for free with a bucket of lime and a brush made from corn husks. Number 8. Leather tanning with brains. Every animal has enough brains to tan its own hide. That statement, repeated around frontier homesteads for generations, was not folklore. It was chemistry. The phospholipids in animal brains act as a natural emulsifier that penetrates rawhide and softens the collagen fibers into supple, workable leather. Pioneers would scrape a fresh hide clean of flesh and fat. Soak it in a solution of wood ash, lye to loosen the hair, scrape it again, then work a paste of mashed brains into the damp surface by hand for hours. The hide was stretched, smoked over a low fire to set the tanning, and the result was soft, durable buckskin that could be sewn into clothing, moccasins, bags, and dozens of other necessities. No chemicals purchased, no tanning salon required, just the animal itself providing everything needed to make its own skin useful. Commercial tanning uses chromium salts, a process that generates toxic waste and requires industrial treatment. The pioneer method produced zero waste and required nothing but labor and knowledge. Number 7. Gravity-fed spring water systems. Pioneers who homesteaded near hillside springs engineered their own running water without pumps or electricity. They located the spring source uphill from the cabin, built a stone or wooden collection box around it to keep it clean, and ran a hollowed log or a length of hand-forged iron pipe downhill to the house. Gravity did the rest. Cold, clean spring water flowed continuously into a kitchen trough, a livestock tank, or a spring house where dairy and meat were kept cool by the running water passing beneath stone shelves. Some systems ran for decades without maintenance. The engineering was simple. Water flows downhill. Contain the source. Direct the flow. Use the cold temperature for refrigeration along the way. No water bill, no electric pump, no well drilling company. Just observation of the landscape and the willingness to dig a trench and lay pipe. Municipal water systems replaced private springs throughout the 20th century, and building codes in many areas now make it difficult or illegal to use spring water as a primary household source, even on your own land. Number 6. Pemmican for indefinite food storage. Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains perfected pemmican over thousands of years, and frontier pioneers adopted the technique because nothing else came close to its combination of nutrition, portability, and shelf life. Lean meat, usually buffalo or venison, was cut into thin strips and dried completely in the sun or over low smoke until brittle. The dried meat was then pounded into a powder and mixed roughly 1-to-1 by weight with rendered animal fat. Dried berries, usually chokecherries or Saskatoon berries, were added for flavor and additional nutrients. The mixture was packed tightly into rawhide bags or intestinal casings and sealed with a layer of melted fat. Properly made pemmican could last for years without refrigeration. Fur traders and explorers survived entire winters on nothing else. The combination of protein, fat, and preserved carbohydrates provided complete nutrition in a package that weighed almost nothing relative to its caloric density. A single pound of pemmican could deliver over 3,000 calories. Today, the survival food industry sells freeze-dried meal kits for hundreds of dollars. Pemmican costs nothing if you can hunt, dry, and render fat, skills pioneers possessed as naturally as breathing. Third pattern break. There is a reason this knowledge makes certain industries uncomfortable. A person who can make their own soap, preserve their own food, filter their own water, grow their own seed, tan their own leather, and treat their own minor ailments is a person who does not need to buy those things. They are a terrible consumer. The entire structure of modern commerce depends on dependency, not enforced dependency, not conspiratorial dependency, but the gentle, comfortable dependency of convenience. It is easier to buy soap than to make it. It is easier to buy seeds than to save them. And over 3 or 4 generations, easier became the only option because the knowledge of the alternative simply vanished. The pioneers were not smarter than we are. They were not tougher or more virtuous. They simply lived in a world where knowing how to do things yourself was not optional. It was survival. What this list represents is not nostalgia. It is a backup plan that most Americans no longer have. Number 5, fermented food preservation. Before canning jars and freezers, fermentation was how pioneers preserved the harvest. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, beets, turnips, green beans, and even corn were preserved in salt brine and allowed to ferment in stoneware crocks stored in root cellars. The lactic acid produced by beneficial bacteria during fermentation lowered the pH enough to prevent spoilage for months. The process required only vegetables, salt, water, and a container. No special equipment, no vinegar, no canning lids, no boiling water bath, just salt and time. The fermented foods were not merely preserved, they were transformed into something more nutritious than the fresh originals. The fermentation process produced B vitamins, increased mineral bioavailability, and created probiotics that supported gut health decades before the word probiotic existed. When commercial canning and refrigeration became widespread in the early 20th century, home fermentation declined dramatically. The USDA promoted pressure canning and freezing as safer alternatives, and within a generation, the crocks were emptied and the knowledge faded. Number 4. Deadfall traps and snares for protein. When the pantry was bare and the nearest store was a 3-day ride, pioneers fed their families with simple traps that required no ammunition and no firearms. Deadfall traps, built from 3 sticks and a heavy flat rock, could catch rabbits, squirrels, and other small game with no moving parts and no materials that could not be found in any forest in America. Snares made from twisted plant fiber or horsehair were set along game trails and checked each morning. A single rabbit provided enough meat for a family meal and enough hide for a pair of mittens. These trapping skills were borrowed from and shared with indigenous communities who had refined them over millennia. A man who understood animal behavior and could build a trap from sticks and string would never starve in the American wilderness. That statement was true in 1850, and it is still true today. Modern hunting requires expensive firearms, ammunition, licenses, tags, and designated seasons. Pioneer trapping required observation and 3 sticks. Number 3. Clay oven construction from local earth. Pioneers without cast iron stoves baked bread, roasted meat, and cooked entire meals in ovens they built from the dirt beneath their feet. A mixture of clay-rich subsoil, straw, or grass for binding, and water was shaped over a sand form into a dome roughly 3 feet in diameter. Once dried, the sand was scooped out, a fire was built inside to cure the clay, and the oven was ready to use. A properly built clay oven retained heat for hours after the fire burned down, allowing sequential baking. Bread went in first at the highest temperature, then pies, then slow roasts as the oven gradually cooled. The materials were free. Construction took a day. The oven lasted for years with minor patching. When cast iron cookstoves became affordable in the mid-1800s and gas and electric ovens arrived in the early 1900s, clay ovens disappeared from the American landscape. Today, an artisan pizza oven built to the same basic design costs $2,000 to $5,000 installed. Pioneers built the same thing for nothing from the ground they stood on. Number 2. Flax to linen textile production. The most self-sufficient pioneer families grew flax and turned it into linen cloth without purchasing a single thing. Flax was planted in spring, harvested in late summer, and then soaked for several weeks in a process called retting until the outer fibers separated from the woody core. Those fibers were dried, beaten, combed, spun into thread on a spinning wheel, and woven into fabric on a hand loom. The entire process, from seed to shirt, happened on a single homestead with equipment the family built themselves. Linen was stronger than cotton, more durable than wool in warm weather, and could be produced anywhere flax would grow, which was nearly everywhere in the temperate United States. By the mid-1800s, industrial textile mills undercut homespun fabric on price, and the laborious process of home linen production was abandoned. The skills of retting, hackling, spinning, and weaving disappeared within 2 generations. Today, Americans spend an average of $1,700 per year on clothing. Pioneer families who grew flax spent nothing beyond the labor of their own hands. Number 1. Complete self-sufficiency as a unified homestead system. Here is what every entry on this list points toward. No single trick on this list was the secret. The secret was that all of them worked together as a complete interlocking system of independence. The fire that heated the cabin produced ash for soap, fertilizer, and pest control. The animals that provided meat also provided fat for candles and soap, brains for tanning, and bones for broth. The garden that fed the family also provided seeds for next year and scraps for vinegar. The spring that watered the livestock also cooled the spring house. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. Every output became an input for something else. This was not primitive living. This was closed-loop engineering practiced by people who could not afford to throw anything away. The modern American household is the opposite. It is an open system that requires constant inputs of purchased goods and generates constant outputs of waste. Everything flows in one direction, from store to house to landfill. Pioneers ran their homes like ecosystems. We run ours like vending machines. The government did not ban these skills. It did not need to. It simply built an economy where buying was easier than knowing. And within 3 generations, the knowing disappeared on its own. But here's what matters. Every single skill on this list still works. The chemistry has not changed. The biology has not changed. Gravity still pulls water downhill. Salt still preserves food. Ash still makes soap. Seeds still grow into the same plants they came from. The only thing that changed is us. Here is my challenge. Try one of these, just one. Make vinegar from apple scraps. Save seeds from your best tomato plant. Build a charcoal water filter in your backyard. Then come back and tell me if your great-great-grandmother was just being old-fashioned, or if she knew something we were quietly encouraged to forget. Because I started saving wood ash this winter, and I have not bought fertilizer since. I made soap last month from beef tallow, and it is still sitting on my sink, working better than the bar I used to buy for $4. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the vinegar gets more love than the pemmican, because these were not just pioneer tricks. They were the blueprint for a life that did not depend on anyone else's supply chain. Your ancestors knew how to live without asking permission. Now you do too.